On today's episode of Living Cosmos, what we are lacking today is a compelling vision for masculine strength. Collectively, in our social dialogue, we have labeled masculine strength as the problem and therefore created this rift, this identity crisis for men trying to figure out how to be men and show up in a good way and be sensitive, and how to be strong or masculine. There is no actual vision for that collectively in our culture. And this is where I want to really enter the dialogue. Here's where I want to add something new. Welcome to the Living Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sturm. Our focus is on the questions, who am I, and what is my place in the cosmos? This exploration is in service to understanding our true nature on our path toward human realization. Today, we recognize that the universe has been on a journey of evolution from undifferentiated particles into life, consciousness, and even podcasts. You and I are vastly interwoven into this living, breathing cosmos. Our stories of healing, awakening, and self-actualization are each threads in the evolutionary tapestry of the cosmos. So, center in yourself and join me for this transmission. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Living Cosmos podcast. I'm Matt, your host, and I'm very excited today to be sharing about redefining masculine strength. So as you may know, I have written a book called The Organic Masculine, and I'm working on book number 2. It's a 4-part series. It's a workbook around masculinity. And I've been doing a lot of research, both inner research and outer research around the topic of masculinity, and men's work is a real passion of mine. So today, I'm going to share maybe the big picture of where I think we need to go in terms of masculinity. So for starters, just take a moment, and when you think of a man who is manly or masculine, what traits come to mind? What qualities come to mind for you? So just take a few breaths and tune in. There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm willing to guess that somewhere on your list, if you were to really sit down and hone in on it, the word strength would show up. And the reason I'm confident about this is because in 2017, the Pew Research Center asked this same question in a survey of American adults. The number one word in their results was strong. So traits of a man who is manly or masculine, strong is the number one word that came up. And just in case you're interested, the other words besides strong were assertive, muscular, confident, deep voice, and facial hair. So my joke is I've been working on my facial hair and my deep voice after seeing this survey. But strong is the number one quality that we broadly in our culture think about with regards to manliness or masculinity. So for me on my path, I grew up for most of my teens and 20s pretty strongly disowning my masculinity. I saw masculinity as the problem. I saw the harm that men were causing in the world, and I absolutely could not align myself with that type of masculinity. And the masculinity that I was in contact with within myself, it was really a struggle for me to connect with. So then, about 10 years ago, right around my Saturn returns, I was 30 years old, I took a year to volunteer and travel across Asia. I had some friends who were doing a similar travel trip through Asia, and they said, hey, we're doing this Tantra retreat in Thailand. Do you want to come? I didn't know anything about Tantra, and I was like, okay, sure, why not? My partner and I at the time, like, great, let's do it. Why not? So we show up, and I, for the first time, get exposed to sacred sexuality, to yoga as a spiritual practice, to ways that I could engage my energy in masculine and feminine polarity. And these tools were really powerful, and I was getting super excited about it. In particular, the idea that my sexuality is sacred, that it's inherently good. And in particular, that men and women can both be equal practitioners and leaders in a spiritual community, which was not the imprint that I got from my upbringing. So I was like really excited about it, and a lot of cool things were starting to happen in my body. But it brought me into my inner conflict with masculinity, because the teachings around polarity were, okay, if you're male, embody this masculine polarity and do that in connection with your female partner who's embodying the feminine. And it's very heteronormative. That was part of my problem with it. But my deeper problem was that the picture of masculinity that I was holding, I did not like. I was not into it. So I almost walked away from that school and their teachings. And instead, I sat down with one of the instructors and had like a vulnerable conversation about this. And he said, yeah, I had a similar journey where I really struggled. And I just decided, what if I embraced my masculinity just to try it out, just to see? And so he kind of challenged me to do that. And he didn't say it needs to look a particular way. He just said, reach in and see what it looks like for you. And that was incredibly confronting for me. But I guess to my credit, because it has been one of the most important decisions that I've made in my adult life, I went for it. I said, okay, I'm going to dig into my masculinity. And if I'm going to own the masculine label, then it needs to be something that works for me. It has to be something that I have felt through and discerned my way into all the way, so that I can feel confident to wear it, given all of the baggage that masculinity brings in the world. And so my goal with that was to find an authentic version of masculinity, but also a version of masculinity where I felt like I was contributing to humanity in a positive way by being a man. And that has unlocked so much for me. I started going into it and digging into it and reading and talking, and then joined men's groups and joined multiple men's groups, and then went to men's retreats, and then started leading men's groups, and then started leading men's retreats. And then, I recently wrote a book. So I'm on the men's work path. It's one of the biggest passions in my life today. And honestly, as a human who has come into incarnation as a upper middle class white male, all the privilege categories, basically, I hold most of them. Working on an updated, life affirming version of masculinity is one of maybe the most effective ways that I can contribute to the world positively. From the imprint that I got, which was not life affirming masculinity, to update that. And there's something specific about masculinity, because the way that initiation works, the process of initiation works, it's gendered. It's not a racial process. It's not a class process. It's a gendered process. So I go from being a boy to a teenage heroic warrior to a man to an elder. And there's a feminine pathway, and gender is the mechanism that the archetypal process of initiation works on. And so for that reason, out of all the social identity categories, gender is particularly potent. So before I go into redefining masculine strength, I want to take a moment to get really clear about what the issues are with masculinity. Because we all kind of go, masculinity is bad or patriarchy is bad. But that can mean a lot of different things. So I really want to clarify and be specific here. The first is that men hold the vast majority of wealth, power, and authority in the world. So according to the United Nations, 87% of world leaders are men. According to Fortune magazine, 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are men. And according to Forbes, 87% of billionaires are men. The word for this, or the term for this, is hegemonic masculinity. Oftentimes we hear this called patriarchy. Hegemonic masculinity is the term I prefer to use. So hegemony means dominant power. This term describes a system where a small number of men wield power over everyone else in society, over women, over minority groups, and including other men. And so the hegemonic masculinity term is specific around the power that men are wielding, some men are wielding in the world. So just the fact that our political and economic power globally is so overwhelmingly imbalanced is harmful for humanity and the earth. And there are other studies around this, but you don't really have to look statistically. You can just intuitively feel like if all genders were sharing power and authority equally, then all of us would be able to make better decisions on behalf of humanity because all of our voices and perspectives would be included, right? So hegemonic masculinity is one of the ways that men are causing harm, or rather that our global system is out of whack. Now, we can be even more explicit about how men are causing harm. So 98% of sexual assaults are committed by men. And this is from a 2010 study from the CDC. 95% of homicides globally are committed by men. And this is from a United Nations report from 2023. So 98% of sexual assaults and 95% of homicides are committed by men. In terms of physical violence, men perpetrate the vast majority of it. So the other term that gets thrown around is toxic masculinity. But that can mean just about anything. And so again, male violence points to the specific ways that men are causing harm. And so both hegemonic masculinity and male violence are well-defined terms, and I don't think there's a lot of argument here. I think we can all get on board with these are issues facing humanity today. And moreover, these two particular issues, hegemonic masculinity and male violence, touch almost all of the other issues that humanity is facing today. So the wealth disparity, the systemic forms of oppression, war, climate change, all of these are tied to these imbalances in male and masculine expressions. So I want to go on record here and say we need to fundamentally change these social systems, institutions, and governance models that we are using in the world today. What we need is a new operating system. And in addition to changing the systems, which is like the rules and the behaviors that we're using, I've come to understand that we can't change those without also changing our understanding of what masculinity means. We need to transform our values, beliefs, and identities around masculinity that we hold as a culture, and that these two things work together. The culture, what we believe and understand and identify with, works hand in hand with our social systems and institutions. So that brings me to the purpose of this podcast here. In order to change the social systems, I'm going to use culture, our understanding of what masculinity means. And when we change what we think, that in turn will change how we engage with the world. So I want to use this opportunity to update our understanding of masculinity, starting with the most prevalent masculine trait, which is strength. The number one thing that broadly we think of and associate with masculinity is strength. Now, it turns out that strong masculinity can mean a wide variety of things. How we understand strength depends upon the worldview that we're holding. So, in order to get the full picture here, I want to look at masculine strength, and I'm going to take you on a journey through the different meanings of masculine strength across a series of distinct worldviews. And these are the same worldviews that I covered in podcast episode 1. So we're going to begin with traditional masculine strength. The traditional worldview and traditional paradigm cropped up at the beginning of human civilization about 10,000 years ago. And in the West, in, I would say, European Mediterranean culture, we developed a collective identity about what it means to be a man. It's a man's job to fight, to rule, and to provide. And this you could call patriarchy. So there are many mythological images of the strong man. The one that I like to highlight is Atlas. So Atlas was a Greek god, and his job was, with his strength, his job was to hold up the sky and the heavens. That was his task. And he had a number of daughters, and they would sleep at his feet. And so I love this image because here is the guy alone holding the whole heavens and sky on his shoulders. I got it. Cool, I got it. And then the feminine is protected by him and is able to sleep at his feet. And this is the traditional worldview, the traditional picture of the strong man. There is an author, G. Michael Hopf, who writes science fiction, and he's in this worldview, and he has a quote which expresses it so poignantly and beautifully. It's like really nailed it. So the quote is, "Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times." So that's G. Michael Hopf. Now, there is a correlation here between strong or weak men and the state of the world. Basically, strong men make a good world and weak men make a bad world. And so it is the responsibility of men to be strong for the sake of the world. In the traditional worldview, men hold the seat of authority and are therefore responsible. So, men who are listening to this, we have inherited a masculine mythology that tells us we need to toughen up. It tells us we need to dominate or else be dominated. We need to be in control, and that this is what it means to be strong. If we do not fit this image, then we are weak. And being weak is a fate worse than death for a man. And that gets hammered into us in grade school, middle school, high school, when we're boys, from other boys, from adults, and then gets reinforced when we enter the dating world and women selectively choose for strong men. So this is something that this picture is something that all of us hold together and participate in together. Now, I want to bring our attention to how masculine strength impacts boys. Because like I said, we all start to get this conditioning early in life when we are very impressionable, not in our power, weak in some ways. We are still forming our identities. So in this period, Our culture teaches boys to be violent. As a boy myself, I can't count the number of times that I was told, hold your head up, stick up for yourself, walk it off, and act like a man. And all of this conditioning taught me that I needed to cut off, to sever my connection to my emotions and my innocence and my beauty and my preciousness along with it in order to be strong. And that this is how I would succeed as a man in the world. And that is the psychological and emotional violence that the mythic traditional worldview enacts upon men. And it does this so that men can be physically and politically or economically violent in order to protect the tribe, in order to sit at the top of the pyramid, to hold the authority, to be responsible for the world. So to really hone in on this view and masculine strength, in the traditional worldview, masculine strength creates safety through authority. So as a man, because I am strong, I will be the authority. I will fight, I will rule, I will provide, and that creates safety for myself, for my family and loved ones, for the people in my group. So that is masculine strength in the traditional worldview. Now I want to segue to the next worldview that I work with, which is called the mental modern worldview. So modern masculine strength is vastly different from traditional masculine strength. Modern men, we are here to work, to build, to explore, to research, to innovate, and more broadly, what I put this under is achieve. Some researchers call this achievement consciousness. It is our role as men to climb the corporate ladder, to make breakthroughs in technology, to use science to extract resources and build great things. Modern masculine strength is our capacity for progress. And for the modern man, strength creates value. Modernity is focused on achievement and creating value. So this version of masculinity has given us constitutional democracy, modern science, and liberal education, among other things. It's brought real gifts into the world. And, however, it has also contributed to wealth disparity, the existential threat of climate change, the existential threat of nuclear war, and many of the issues that we are facing as a species today. So if we are going to continue to exist as a civilization on this planet, we are going to have to move beyond modernity as our primary paradigm and beyond the achievement masculinity as our primary identity as men. Just to sum it up, in the modern worldview, masculine strength creates value through achievement. Okay, that's the summary statement. Our next worldview is plural postmodern. The postmodern version of masculine strength is a really interesting one. It's nuanced. Once we get to postmodernity, things become a lot more complex. Complexity is one of the hallmarks of postmodernity. The postmodern man is called the sensitive new age guy. And the little litmus test that I like to use is, guys, if you've ever tried using facial cream, this is a good test for the sensitive postmodern man. And I can say I'm not ashamed to include myself. I have tried facial cream. I've checked it out. I've been like, oh, that's kind of nice, right? It's a opening to our feminine sides, to our sensitivity. It's a welcoming of our vulnerability. So this worldview includes the effeminate man. It's very concentrated in the academic world. And it also includes, and I'm raising my hand here, the guy who has done a lot of therapy and has learned to talk about his feelings. So Brene Brown has this quote. I love this quote. A real man knows that being vulnerable and expressing his emotions is a sign of courage, not weakness. At the postmodern level of development, we recognize that masculine strength has been and is being funneled into hegemonic masculinity and male violence. And so we equate masculine strength with harm. We're saying, yeah, men in power, men using their strength is creating all of the issues in the world. So in the postmodern worldview, masculine strength is the problem, and men should be sensitive instead. But if the number one trait that we associate with masculinity is strength, and we're now saying, don't be strong, then we have created an identity crisis for masculinity. I was in this for many years. I see this a lot in the men who come to me to do men's work. So even though the postmodern worldview has given us incredible tools for anti-oppression work, it has failed to enroll men in a large-scale movement. One of my favorite authors on masculinity, Bell Hooks, summarizes the whole situation like this. So here's a quote from her. Once the, quote, new man, that is, the man changed by feminism, was represented as a wimp, as overcooked broccoli dominated by powerful females who were secretly longing for his macho counterpart, masses of men lost interest. What we are lacking today is a compelling vision for masculine strength. Collectively, in our social dialogue, we have labeled masculine strength as the problem and therefore created this rift, this identity crisis for men trying to figure out how to be men and show up in a good way and be sensitive, and how to be strong or masculine. There is no actual vision for that collectively in our culture. And this is where I want to really enter the dialogue. Here's where I want to add something new. In order to do that, I'm going to take a moment to share with you probably my favorite social justice anti-oppression tool. It's called the Hardiman and Jackson Social Identity Development Process. So Hardiman and Jackson are two academic researchers, and one of them was working on white identity development, and the other was working on black identity development. And then what they discovered is that it's the same pathway. It looks slightly different, but the core features are the same. And so they put their two racial identity development models together to make it, applicable to racial anti-oppression work. So here's how it goes. The first step, the first phase is naive, meaning we have no conditioning. And this is how you are born and how I am born. We all enter the world kind of blank slate with regards to race. And I'll also add in gender and class and all of the other group identities that we receive from society. After the first 6 to 9 months, we begin to take in that conditioning. And so it begins very quickly. And by the time we're 3 or 4 years old, we have already begun to not only internalize, but then to behave with the rules of race, ethnicity, class, gender, sex, age, all of that. So this next step that we move into is called acceptance. And acceptance means this is just the way that the world is. Some people are white, some people are black, some people are men, some people are women, and we're just doing our best to navigate the world as it's given to us. So we are in acceptance. Sometimes the acculturation process is implicit, I mean, we just see how other people behave and then we adopt that behavior. Sometimes it's explicit. Sometimes there are people in our life who are saying, yeah, those people act like this and our people act like this instead. And we get that stereotypical imprint explicitly. Sometimes our acceptance, and this is true of all the following phases, can be passive or it can be active. So passive means this is just how it is. I'm going along for the ride. Active acceptance means I'm consciously internalizing and then promoting that category or these categories of my social intersection. The next phase is resistance. So at some point, if we decide to work on ourselves with regards to these group identity categories, we will begin to see that there is a system at play which is socially constructed. And that system has these rules which are seemingly kind of arbitrary, like they came out of historical causes, sure, but they're all human causes. There's not an inherentness to race or to gender, that we are all doing gender together because we all agree that this is how it works. And then we see how actually it doesn't really work that great. The rules don't work for me. The rules don't work for many people, and contributes to suffering in kind of a big way in the world. And so we resist. Sometimes, again, this resistance can be passive. So like for me on my journey of masculinity in my teens and 20s, I was in passive resistance, and I call that disaffected masculinity. I was like, well, that doesn't work, so I'm just going to go over here and do my non-masculine thing over here. Passive resistance. Sometimes it's active resistance. I'm seeing instances of injustice. I'm using my voice. I'm fighting. I'm an activist. I'm getting riled up against the system. But either way, we move from accepting this is how things are to resisting. These things don't need to be this way, and I do not need to buy into them anymore. After the resistance step comes redefinition. In redefinition, I find my authentic version of this identity category, of race, of ethnicity, of class, of gender, of sexual orientation. There are many of them. Redefinition means I found the version of this which is authentic for me. Sometimes redefinition means I'm going to keep my category. So like in my case, I decided to lean into masculinity and embrace being a man. Sometimes redefinition means I'm going to become trans. I am going to transcend gender altogether. I am going to do something different. It does not mean that I have to stay with what was given to me when I was born. But the core feature is that redefinition means I have found the version which works for me. There is a reclaiming that happens with redefinition, where I get back in touch with that culture or identity group from a new way. I'm able to welcome the positive aspects of it, and I'm able to connect with folks who are not in my category from a different place, outside of the harmful power structures that society gives us. So that's redefinition. And then the final step is internalization. So in internalization, I begin to see all the little nooks and crannies where this acculturated identity has seeped into my behavior, my unconscious beliefs, and I just make these little updates along the way. And at this stage, I might begin to do social work, group collective work on our culture, because now I've kind of got the download of the new way, and I'm ready to bring that out and help other people on their journey. So it's an ongoing process of updating and continuing to evolve this identity category. Okay? So in summary, the stages are naive with no conditioning, and then acceptance, and then resistance, redefinition, and finally internalization. So when I saw this and started working through it on my own, eventually at some point I had the aha moment of mapping this onto the worldviews, the developmental ladder of identity and values and culture that I had been working with, the integral model. And they map right on. So the very first level, which I haven't talked about on this podcast yet, in the integral model is archaic. Archaic is where we all begin life at. And The naive phase maps right onto the archaic worldview, the archaic paradigm. We then have a magical tribal worldview or paradigm, which I also haven't gone into on this podcast yet. But that's where acceptance begins. And this acceptance phase spans the magical tribal, mythic traditional, and mental modern worldviews. Within each one of these worldviews, the system is taken for granted. And as an individual, I'm just choosing to maximize my value or what I'm able to do within the system. I'm trying to work inside of the system. So that's the acceptance of this is the way things are. When I get to the plural postmodern worldview, I enter resistance. And the postmodern term for this is deconstruction. I begin to take apart these conditioned identities that have been handed to me. The next step is integral sources in wholeness, in connecting with the authentic self. And that corresponds to the redefinition step in the Hardiman and Jackson model. After integral, there's another phase, another worldview called high integral, and that connects with the internalization phase of Hardiman and Jackson. So they map right on. And this is a great example of the meta model or the multi-paradigmatic theory of integral. Where this system of worldviews came from is Ken Wilber looked at all of the different developmental models he could get his hands on, cross-referenced them together and said, wow, there is a universal pathway, whether I'm looking at anthropology, sociology, psychology, mysticism, all of them seem to have these similar phases, these similar deep features that we move through. And so here's another one, the Hardiman and Jackson model. It just slides right into this hierarchy of worldviews, which I get excited about. So thus far, we have looked at the acceptance phases and the resistance phase of the Hardiman and Jackson social identity development process. So in the traditional worldview, masculine strength creates safety through authority. And when I'm inside that worldview, I just accept that that's how things are. In the modern worldview, masculine strength creates value through achievement. And again, I just accept that this is the system and I'm trying to operate within the system. The resistance phase at postmodern says, no, masculine strength, no, we don't want that. We want sensitive men instead, the sensitive new age guy, resistance. So now, having given you this model and walked us through to this point, the really exciting next step, and it's a big one, is into the integral worldview, is into the redefinition phase of the social identity development process. As I mentioned earlier, the integral worldview sources in the experience of wholeness. Take a breath with me and feel your whole self. And take another breath right into the center of your being. From this place of centered wholeness, feel your connection with me. Feel the earth beneath you. Feel your connection with life unfolding all around you. From wholeness, we recognize our part to play in the universe. Now, the core value of the integral worldview is evolution. So take another breath and feel that drive within you to learn and grow. It's the drive that brought you to listen to this talk today. As you move into integral, you begin to experience the inherent goodness of all of life. And in order to step into the sacred world, you must become sacred yourself. Sacred here means precious. Now, if all of life is precious, and all aspects of you are precious, then so is masculinity. Because life is sacred, masculinity is too. It cannot be excluded. Beneath all the distortions and wounding, there is a life-affirming core of masculinity. I call it the organic masculine, and it's available directly to each and every one of us. So, what is masculinity? What does life-affirming masculinity look like? For starters, when you experience the masculine directly, that's it. And that is your guiding light. From my perspective, there are many descriptors, many qualities of masculinity out there. Masculine presence, masculine penetration, masculine strength, masculine structure. All of these are contextual, and they're defined in a particular relationship with the feminine. From my view, there is no universal masculine quality or qualities. It's whatever is showing up right here, right now, that I feel and recognize, that's it. But in the research, they talk about masculinities, that there are many socially constructed masculinities. In my perspective, masculinity is a morphic field, meaning it's a pattern in consciousness. It's a groove that developed along with humanity. And it constellates through archetype, myth, story, through culture, through gender expression and gender identity, and then down into the morphology of our bodies, into our physiology, our genes, our hormones. And this one masculine morphic field is infinitely variable. It is infinitely expressive. We know it when we see it, but there is not one way that it shows up or looks. And in addition, it is constantly evolving, right? So the conversation that we're having about masculinity today is vastly different from the conversation we were having 10 years ago prior to the Me Too movement, which is vastly different than the conversation they were having 100 years ago about what it means to be a man. So masculinity is constantly evolving, and it looks different for each one of us and within each culture. So then more broadly, what can I actually say about life-affirming masculinity? Well, the organic masculine harmonizes with life. Janine Benyus has a quote which I love, which says, "Life creates the conditions conducive to life." When we experience the masculine supporting and uplifting life, that is the organic masculine. There's another quote which I love, Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's not her quote, it's the indigenous wisdom that she's connected to, and it says, "All flourishing is mutual." So when the masculine supports and uplifts life so that it can flourish, that is the organic masculine operating within the integral paradigm. This is something that when you see it, when you feel it, when you experience it, you know it. It is not any external model. I can't tell you what it is because that's another form of cultural conditioning. All I can say is I feel it, and then I can help you look where to find it within yourself. And then you find it and you go, "Oh, I get it. That's it." So then, what does masculine strength look like within this worldview? Well, here's a quote from actually quite a long time ago by one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, Henry Ward Beecher. "Greatness lies not in being strong, but in the right using of strength. And strength is not used rightly when it serves only to carry a man above his fellows for his own solitary glory. He is the greatest whose strength carries up the most hearts by the attraction of his own." So masculine strength goes through a total redefinition within the integral worldview. Redefinition from Hardiman and Jackson's development model. So for starters, Strength is no longer measured by holding power over someone else. It is not hegemonic. Rather, the focus at this level is on empowerment. Not power over, but power with or power as, empowerment. Another word for this is actualization. I want to be all I can be, and I want to support everyone around me to do the same. And as I step into that desire to support others to evolve, that's the core trait here, with this comes the recognition that each person knows what is best for them. And in the proper conditions, they will naturally move towards their own well-being. This is an innate feature of life. Hakomi calls it organicity. We naturally move toward wholeness. So strength is about empowerment. The next important point I want to make about strength at Integral is that it sources in aliveness instead of in the ego. In the prior worldviews, my ego is the one that wants to be an authority or wants to be a top achiever. And my personality attempts to own and hold strength. At Integral, I recognize that my strength is my aliveness moving through me. So in that sense, I'm the shepherd, I'm the steward of strength. So feel inside yourself right now and connect with your aliveness. Notice the aliveness of your intelligence, of the passion of your emotions, of the potency of your body. Take a big breath and let it feel good. This is your strength, and this is our strength together. So in the Integral worldview, the vitality of life is the source of masculine strength. And I'll say that again. The vitality of life is the source of masculine strength. And we recognize that the masculine is not strong alone. He is strong to the extent that he uplifts and is uplifted by all other genders. So instead of having power and resources horribly imbalanced, like the quotes that I gave you at the beginning of the talk, masculine strength sources in balance with the feminine. Imagine how much stronger men will become when half of our world leaders, CEOs, and billionaires are women. But even that example is still kind of based on a false binary, because humanity expresses through a plurality of genders and sexualities. So where our Integral lands, if you could imagine a web, and masculinity is one node on that web, and actually there are many sub-nodes of masculine expressions, and then there are many sub-nodes of the feminine expression, and then there are the transgender, agender, all other gender folks woven together in this web. And we are all strong on the web together because we are all human together. And this is our strength. Masculinity is part of that, but it's also connected to trans strength, feminine strength, all genders being strong together. So personally, I believe that empowering ourselves and empowering each other is the antidote to hegemonic masculinity. That by moving through the phases of the Hardiman and Jackson model, we naturally end up at this place of redefinition in empowerment. As more and more of us move there, in particular, as the cultural elite move there and begin to shift our culture, then the social institutions and structures are going to move along with it. And that is how we change hegemonic masculinity. Violence is so overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. And the way that we shift violence is by mutually blessing each other and by ensuring all of our own needs and the needs of all other people and all other identity groups are being satisfied. When we move into the wholeness of having all of our needs met, the impulses for violence begin to dissolve away. And in fact, being violent is both risky and carries really large consequences. So we start to recognize that, and we will not choose violence if it's not in our own interest, which is usually driven by unmet needs. So when we're able to satisfy all of our needs, and when all of the social identity groups, ethno-national groups, religious groups, political groups are able to get their needs met as well, then the self-perpetuating cycles of violence begin to dissolve. And instead, we move into virtuous cycles of blessing each other. And this is how we transform male violence. In order to change these social systems, we need all genders to be strong, including masculinity. Take a nice deep breath with me. So this is my perspective on redefining masculine strength. I touched briefly on my view that masculinity is a morphic field and the view that there are a plurality of genders. I'm going to continue this conversation for supporting members on my Patreon account with a companion audio where I talk about the 3 primal high archetypes of masculine, feminine, and androgen. In my view, there are 3 of them, and I'll share why, and I'll share what they look like. So if you'd like to hear that, head over to Patreon. And thank you so much for joining me today. Aloha. Thank you for joining us today for the Living Cosmos podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review and a rating on whatever podcast platform you use to access it. If you'd like to go deeper, I'd encourage you to head over to livingcosmos.com, where I have a whole host of free videos and resources, as well as whatever courses I'm offering today. This podcast is made possible by subscribers to my Patreon, Living Cosmos. You can head over there to become a member to access bonus material and content. You can also check out my book, The Organic Masculine, and connect with me on the Living Cosmos Facebook group. Thanks again, and aloha.